Namaste, friends. Namaste, friends. This is Shachin Banath. I am from the FIIDS, and as you know, the FIIDS is the foundation of Indian industrial study. We involved in policy studies, analysis, awareness regarding the Indian and the Indian diaspora issues. Today's event is a very special event for us. We have a very esteemed guest, Mr. GuruPrakash Paswan. He is a BJP nation spokesperson, MLC, and a distinguished professor of law. So I invite Guruji on the stage, please. And on the stage we have Mr. Khandera Khan. He's a founding director for FIIDS. I'll give the mic to Khandera ji to move forward with the program.
Thank you. Thank you, Satyaji. Welcome, everybody. So first of all, we have a lot of prominent people from Indo-American community and those who are actually active in policy groups. Like we have Diaspora, who has been inspiration, and is also founder of American for Hindus, FIIDS, which is a leading pack. We also have here Rakhi Israni. Israni is also active in various organizations, Hindu and India related. Is also part of so it's a policy group. We have Yogi Chuk, who is a political analyst. We have homeschool founder Maulik Shuklaji and many other folks. Or Dinesh Nilawar is also a prominent host of many talks and also intellectual contributor in many activities. We have to entrepreneurs. Recognizing everybody is difficult, but we are here, and that today is a kind of a special day. If you look at it, long weekend and Labor Day long weekend. This is before the whole schools and hectic period starts. This is the long vacation, and afterwards is going to be in Thanksgiving. So many people are decided to go out. Also, it is one of the hottest day. There are many other activities, including Ganesh, going on. But despite all that, this is the group of prominent people who came here, assembled. Really welcome, because the topic here is also very important. More than the topic, we have a very distinguished speaker, my good friend, GuruPrakash Paswan. He actually my association with him was almost more than 10 years, almost like 2012, 2022, like 10 years. And my first interaction had been that he was part of India Foundation, which is the leading think tank in India, in the global kind of presence. It's a partner. It's partner with India Foundation. He was one of the prominent research analyst in India Foundation. He was also, I think, that time completed the law and had started teaching in Delhi, one of the colleges. And that's where we met at various conferences, India conference, ideas, then many of them, the air motion dream related, counter-terrorism related. So he has been active in all those. He then I was very surprised. I was actually thought that he will be one of the leading intellectuals. He is intellectual, but would be a leading think tank from India. But then he decided to move back to Bihar. So being in politics. Politics is not new to him. His father has been in politics. That could be his calling. He is one of the most articulate on most difficult topics, representing Bharatiya Janata Party's viewpoints, and also in that way, government's positioning in various debates. Those of you who tune to Indian channels, many times you can see him there. So he's very young and dynamic, and we are good to have him today. And very one thing is sure that he can take any challenges, intellectual challenge, and his articulations are very apt and very appropriate occasion and also correct with all the context. So thank you for Prakash. Stand and speak. No. You can answer. Whichever is comfortable. What are the comfortable that you can you PPT there? I will put it here.
Thank you so much, Mandirauji, and my special gratitude to all of you present here. Mandirauji has been very generous in his introduction. He set the bar so high, and obviously our association goes long back. But the topic which we are here to discuss, I have a dialogue instead of a monologue about diversity and inclusion, because we have seen diversity and inclusion has become a buzzword when it comes to United States, and how diversity and inclusion has been very inherent to our culture and civilization. You are aware of the concept of Antyodaya. If you break the word Antyodaya, Ant and Uday. Ant is essentially the person who is standing the last of the line, regardless of his or her caste, creed, religion, community. He or she must rise. The situation of circumstances must be so supportive that the last person in the line rises. Antyodaya. So our spirit of diversity and inclusion has been very inherent to our thinking, and how in the last 8 years specifically, from the government side, the ruling dispensation, how fundamentally the concept of Antyodaya, diversity and inclusion is being reflected in our practice. The next. So conceptually, it was Pandit Deen Dayal Upadhyay who gave the concept of Antyodaya. And if you go through the making of our constitution, Ambedkar gave 3 warnings, and these warnings are very relevant and significant today as well. In one of his fundamental speeches, he said on 26th of January 1950, we are going to enter into a life of contradictions. We will have equality in politics with the principle of one man, one vote, but we will have gross inequality in our social and economic life. एक राष्ट्र के रूप में हम ऐसे जीवन में प्रवेश करने वाले हैं जो अंतर विरोध से भरा होगा. राजनीति में समानता होगी, लेकिन सामाजिक और आर्थिक जीवन में समानता नहीं होगी. So that was one of the critical warnings that Ambedkar gave, and it is a point to ponder upon, that whether we have achieved that level of equality when it comes to our social life and economic life. The warning which he gave in 1950, it's still something which still resonates with all of us. Likewise, when in 2014, Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi, he was about to deliver his first speech in the Parliament as Prime Minister. He said a very important, मेरी सरकार गरीब, दलित, शोषित, वंचित. These 4 keywords, गरीब, दलित, शोषित और वंचित, इनकी सरकार को. Any policy which we imagine will be focused on these categories. Now, this is something which can only come out of a lived experience. So apart from diversity and inclusion, lived experience is another buzzword which is very apparent. But when it comes to caste and gender, I think, friends, lived experience becomes really important. For a very long period of time, we saw Dalit discourse was being led by and is still being led by non-Dalits. Gender discourse, feminist discourse was led by males, academically also. So this element of lived experience is something which is very critical. And here I landed here yesterday afternoon, and I've been exposed to multiple sectors, Cisco being one of them, how the politics is being played on the issues of caste, and how Dalits are not the real stakeholders. Dalits are not articulating their concerns, but there's someone else. So similar to wokeism, we see a phenomenon of behalfism. That someone else is speaking on someone else's behalf. Whether a Dalit can be a stakeholder in the new Dalit discourse or not, that is a fundamental issue. So poverty is something which was first-hand experienced by the Prime Minister. We are all aware of his journey and how he sort of navigated from a very small place, Vadnagar in Gujarat, first be Chief Minister successfully, then the Prime Minister. And now he has this exceptional record of serving the longest tenure as the democratically elected head of state. 12 years as a chief minister and then 8+ years as the prime minister. This record was previously with the president here, Bill Clinton was governor and then subsequently the president. But now prime minister has surpassed that record. So this distinction of being someone with this track of, and that is something which is, like, as a student of politics, anti-incumbency was something which was always on the radar. But how in the last 8 years, this anti-incumbency has transformed itself into pro-incumbency. Policy has fundamentally shifted. The vocabulary of Indian politics changed. And this is how diversity and inclusion comes. 2014 was also the year when Honorable PM said, Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. Subsequently, Sabka Vishwas was also added. That when we speak of diversity and inclusion, specifically in the Indian context, who do we address? What is the constituency when it comes to किसी भी institution को diverse करना है, वहाँ inclusion लेके आना है, तो किन लोगों को लेके आना है? If you look at the government definition of who is the marginalized, the policies of diversity and inclusion must be imagined. They are ST, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, OBCs, other backward classes, economically weaker sections, differently abled, transgender, victims of drug abuse, senior citizens, and begging. This is, by and large, a broad group from the government of India point of view, which we consider as marginalized, the vulnerable, the disadvantaged. And how do we ensure diversity in our institutions and dignity for these groups? So this is the constituency which I want to clarify. We must also understand that if they are in need of special care or attention, it is not because lack of opportunity, not about absence of merit. Like if you see, there's a very interesting book called Caste as a Social Capital. It's written by Professor R. Vaidyanathan, who is a retired professor of finance from Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. He explains how it's a very thin book, and I recommend it. If you have the time and the interest, you must read it. He tells us how caste acts as a social capital. And one very striking example which he gives is of Palanpur Jains in Rajasthan. That how Palanpur Jains of Rajasthan, they occupy 80% of the global trade when it comes to diamond. access to market, access to skill, access to workforce, multiple factors. So how one community or one caste, one group has some special privileges and others do not. So the debate of merit is also something which is very relative and contextual, which you must understand. So in this specific context, we must have a perspective that these groups who are in need of special care, special attention, it's not because of absence of merit, but it's because of historical reasons. I still remember one of the very important speeches gave by former Prime Minister Bharat Ratna Atal Bihari Vajpayee from the ramparts of Red Fort. The year was 99. He said, in the constitutional scheme of things, the reservation must be viewed as a historical compensation. इतिहास में जो अन्याय हुआ है, अत्याचार हुआ है, उसकी भरपाई करना है. इसके लिए रिजर्वेशन को उस पर्सपेक्टिव से देखने की आवश्यकता है. तो डाइवर्सिटी एंड इंक्लूजन फॉर whom? For them. SC, ST, OBC, EWS, and so on and so forth. It's primarily done by government support, preferential treatment in education. So, like I said, the vocabulary of Indian politics has fundamentally changed. When someone like the Prime Minister says, he talks about sanitation, he talks about Swachh Bharat Abhiyan from the ramparts of Red Fort. It's very critical because a lot of memes were also created back then that as high as Prime Minister is talking about toilets from the Red Fort. But it has brought some revolutionary changes. Like there are data from WHO which suggests that the expense which would have gone for health and sanitation expenditures of women that has gone down by $1 trillion just because toilets were made. The data suggests that in 2014, the toilet accessibility, which was at just 38%, in 2020, it's almost 90%, 98%. And now we are slowly moving towards ODM, open defecation villages. We have achieved at certain level, but some areas still need to be covered. How the UNICEF survey has also suggested that 87% women felt safer. The gross enrollment ratio in high school for girl students, it rises because toilets are being made. It rises because toilets are being constructed. Because now women are feeling safe in pursuing their education as well. So how a simple policy imagination, how a clarion call from the ramparts of Red Fort transforms into such changes, we must understand. Similarly, the Jam Trinity, which you are aware of, there was a sense of financial untouchability. Arthik Chuachu, 44 crore bank accounts. Just imagine 400 million people out of the organized banking structure. Had we not had this bank account structure during the times of COVID, just imagine the situation. Almost a civil war-like situation. It was only possible because of Jandan accounts, that funds that started from Delhi, Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Ann Yojana, and so on and so forth, it reached. And in the same country, there used to be a prime minister who said, if Delhi से 1 रुपए बेचते हैं, तो गांव में 15 पैसे पहुंचते. आज दिल्ली से 1 रुपए चलता है, गांव में 1 रुपए पहुंचता. Now this is something which has fundamentally changed, and this is the reason. I'll keep coming back to this because post 2014, multiple state elections have happened. 2019 was a general election where 4 crore more people voted for the Bharatiya Janata Party. 4 crore votes. We had a election in 2017 in Uttar Pradesh. In 2020, this year, we had Uttar Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Goa, Manipur. And for the first time in the history, governments were repeated with a bigger majority. So what's the reason behind it? It's the faith of the people on a leader who can not only promise but also deliver on this basic elementary things like toilet, like ending financial hardship. How this has impacted our women folks. If toilets are being made, that is women empowerment. If the bank accounts are opening, the bank accounts primarily is in the name of the woman. Triple talaq, which was a politically sensitive issue, but was taken up. Regardless of the opposition, the leadership of the party was very vociferous when it came to abolition of triple talaq. Judiciary also supplemented that effort. Abrogation of Article 3. Now, interesting. In electoral battles, we win. But in the wars of narrative, unfortunately, there is a different story. Now, the narrative, abrogation of Article 370, Citizenship Amendment Act, apparently, and the very fresh example which is in my mind is of burqa, hijab. So, you would have followed that back in India, a lady is wearing a burqa, and behind her there is a portrait of Baba Sahib Ambedkar. It gives us an impression that Ambedkar is sort of validating burqa. And trust me, friends, she is not unmindful of the fact that Ambedkar in his book Pakistan and the Partition of India, page number 255 to 256, he has categorically said that burqa is an indication of slavish mentality. In this chapter only, he observes burqa-clad women walking on Indian streets is the most hideous sight. But the war of narrative is giving you something else. The lady is wearing a burqa. She is giving a speech in defense of burqa. But piche Baba Sahib Ambedkar. What sense does it give to us? And this is what is being consumed, unfortunately. They're far from reality. No connection at the ground level at all. Similarly, the Citizenship Amendment Act, lot of accusations that how it is unconstitutional. Again, using the photograph of Baba Sahib Ambedkar as a tool. This CA is a very interesting story. Jogendranath Mandal, I'm sure some of you have heard of his name. Jogendranath Mandal was the first experiment of Jai Bhim Jain. It was the first experiment of Dalit Muslim unity which miserably failed. He was the first law minister of East Pakistan. And I recommend all of you to go through his 48 pages letter of resignation, where he has written how badly he was insulted. Even today, if you look at the Hindu minorities in Pakistan, there are around 1 crore of them. More than 90% of them are Meghwal, Bhil, Ot, Jatap. Regardless of this, CA is anti-Hindu. We are buying into this narrative. Burqa is something which Ambedkar supported. Abolition of triple talaq is progressive. Application of Article 370 for that matter. I'm sure you're aware that women were denied opportunities. If they marry outside the state of Jammu and Kashmir, their children won't have the rights in the property. Because of Article 370, Dalits, tribals, and OBCs of Jammu and Kashmir, they were not entitled to reservation benefit. But again, there is a narrative of Dalit Muslim unity, no, not right, and we are together. So that is how the battles are being won. The war on narrative. Ujjwala is a similar case that how more than 10 crore refugee connections were made. Very interesting data point has come that sex ratio, which used to be 918 per 1,000 males, has become 1,020 per 1,000. But this is some sort of a magic. The magic reminds me of another term that there is a lot of commentary whenever we they say it's the product of Modi magic, but they don't see Modi mehnat behind. The imagination of building toilets, going through the rigorous web of policy making when it comes to Jandan accounts, the leadership when it came to COVID situation, and that is something which is an eye opener. When he gave a call for Janta Curfew, March 22nd, who would have thought that people would stand solidly behind this call? So, especially focusing on Matri Shakti, you see initiatives like Selfie with Daughter, Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, Sukanya Samriddhi Yojana, holistic healthcare for women, or institutionally also, if you see the infant mortality rate, which used to be 37 per 1,000 births, and it's come down to 30. The maternal mortality rate, so institutional delivery has also fundamentally changed in the last 8 years. And this is a great example of diversity and inclusion. Women leading the nation. I would again like to go back to Ambedkar. He said that I measured the progress of communities by the degree of progress women have achieved. And rightly so. In this war of narrative, where we failed was for the first time in the history of our country, a woman from the tribal community reached the highest constitutional office in the country and no one spoke about it. That was history making in front of our eyes. People who were constantly BJP, anti-Dalit, anti-tribals, anti-backward. But you look at the statistics, it gives you a different perspective, it gives you a different story. In his second term, Prime Minister has appointed 11 women to the Council of Ministries. It is the highest ever number in the history of our country. Departments like Finance, Corporate Affairs, Defense, External Affairs, Sushma Swaraj for that. What an imposing personality. The sort of camaraderie which she had, and I'm sure you would have followed the Twitter diplomacy also that followed. One picture of Sushma ji as a foreign minister still resonates in my mind. When John Kerry was visiting India, tall man, Sushma ji was like this. But the handshake which she gave, nowhere did she sort of give that impression that I'm in awe of your personality. So this is the sort of leadership which we must speak about. Out of 78 MPs, half are from BJP. 6 of 14 BJP ruled Nagar Nigam in UP had women mayors. For the first time, women in defense, permanent commission of women officers in the Air Force and in the Border Routes Organization. We have seen institutionally, there is a report by IMF and World Bank, combined report, that there is a 12% reduction when it comes to extreme power because of available of services, the delivery. We saw how vaccination, in fact, while doing my research, I found out that it took us almost 30 years for polio vaccine to be vaccinated our people. More than 50 years for hepatitis B. But in terms of COVID, you saw only 2 years it was completed. More than 200 crore doses has already been given. But regardless, you see Freedom House report and multiple Freedom Institute report that terms that we are a partial democracy, we are an electoral transparency. The self-appointed custodians of democracy, they are giving us rank. Second, apart from women, the second most important group among the vulnerable for whom diversity and inclusion must be practiced is the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. There is an act, the STs and ST Prevention of Atrocities Act, and how this act was empowered. new offenses were added. And atrocity is something which is very real. And unfortunately, if there is a case of atrocity in Hathras, there is a global hue and cry about it, and rightly so. But if there is a similar or a more gruesome atrocity in a Congress-ruled Rajasthan, the hue and cry is not as proportional. It is as if the Dalits of BJP-ruled state are more Dalits than the Dalits of Congress-ruled state. This is deeply problematic. And now we have seen that this act, because we must realize, friends, that the issue of atrocity is there. Even today, you see, only last year I saw a news from Tamil Nadu. A Dalit boy was wearing a wristwatch, his hands were cut. We keep reading stories on how a Dalit was going to his wedding procession. He had to wear a helmet so that he could save himself from stone bed. So that is something which is a reality. We cannot run away from it. But to face that question, as a society, as a unit, you have to accept. But ये परिवार की समस्या है. परिवार में इसका समाधान नहीं. It is not as if someone from outside will come and lecture us on this. And this is happening now. What I have read about the initiatives like Equality Lab, when they have no locus standi, when they have zero moral authority, they are lecturing us. So that is something which can be done. When it comes to empowering the provisions, the relief fund was also enhanced. The establishment of exclusive special courts and the Supreme Court judgment, which sort of diluted this provisions of Atrocities Act, they were overturned. Helplines. Others Gram Yojana, you see the data, very critical. It focuses on integrated development of SC habitations with a population of more than 50% SC population. The Pradhan Mantri Adarsh Gram Yojana has so far already covered 1.61 crore SCs out of 2.54 crore population in 19,000 villages. And it's distributed across of around roughly 700 districts, 529 districts of 24 states have benefited more than 1 lakh. The toilets also 1,14,000. And then you ask questions like, why is BJP getting defeated? Similarly, again, this is very interesting. In the last 8 years, we have seen what used to be the perception before, that whenever we speak of caste issues, people assume that he or she is now going to speak of reservations. But we must understand that Dalit discourse is much beyond reservations. Dalit discourse is much beyond affirmative action. It's much beyond atrocities. There is a very interesting initiative which is called the Dalit Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, DICCI, Dalit Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. And the slogan of this initiative, this organization is, be job givers, not job seekers. And you'd be surprised to know that today, through Dalit Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, there is a network of more than 15,000 small and big entrepreneurs from scheduled caste and scheduled tribe categories. Some of them are having a turnover of more than 1,000 crores. Now, what is the usual perception of Dalits? Government jobs, government supported education. But there is a different story altogether. And how institutional support through one of the key schemes, which is the Venture Capital Fund for Scheduled Caste, which is again a first of its kind scheme, is encouraging Dalit entrepreneurship. Although the pace is not as it is expected to be, but gaining traction. Mudra Yojana. Apart from venture capital fund, Mudra is another critical area where, interestingly, Mudra benefits almost 35 years, predominantly women. You have loans being sanctioned under different categories for starting your own initiative, for giving up the limit. And interestingly, out of the 35 crore beneficiaries, almost 6 crore beneficiaries are scheduled caste. So this is how you institutionally support it. STs, women. The sanction amount is almost 2 lakh crore. And the women beneficiaries predominantly from SC, ST communities. They're a big benefit. But how do you sort of transform this vision into reality? That the Dalits of today, the new Dalits, their aspirations have now changed. What used to be 10 years ago, what used to be 15 years ago. But unfortunately, the narrative here in Silicon Valley and in some parts of India as well, because of their vested interest, they still want to keep the Dalit aspiration, which used to be the Dalit aspiration 25 years ago. That is the most unfortunate part. And that is the reason you see a lot of resentment against it. So this idea of how a person from the marginalized community of women, a person from the tribal community, Adivasi Samaj, can at least have that imagination that he or she can be job giver, not job seekers. Prime Minister, street vendors, Atmanirbhar. Swanidhi, for workers in the unorganized sector, the street vendors, the ready wale, hila wale, there was no scheme for them. But it was imagined that can we help them institutionally through Swanidhi? And here also the total number of beneficiaries is almost 90. Stand Up India scheme. This scheme started on a very promising note. There are almost 1.25 lakh branches of public sector banks. Each branch of each bank was given a mandate that in your jurisdiction, in your area of operation, you have to support two entrepreneurs. One, either SC or ST, and second, women entrepreneur, under the Stand Up India scheme. And the idea was to eventually create 5 lakh, 10 lakh entrepreneurs. The pace again, it's gaining, but not much is achieved yet. Out of this, there are 19,000 SC borrowers. But eventually, because you see the psyche needs time to evolve, the psyche needs time to transform. But there a sizable number of women entrepreneurs that were emerged. So how the focus on innovation and entrepreneurship has sort of redefined our landscape. Swachh Bharat Mission, I mentioned that more than 11 crore toilets from 2015 to 2022. Large number of beneficiaries are from STs and STs. Next. This is something which is very interesting. Representation. If you look at the first graph, the Council of Ministers, for the first time in our history, because representation is something which is very crucial. One is symbolic representation. If that symbolic representation is realistic or not, this can be judged. But representation at critical decision-making positions. For the first time, you see 12 ministers from the scheduled caste category, 8 ministers from the scheduled tribe category, women, OBCs. So this is something which was not imagined before. For the first time in the history of Uttar Pradesh, we had 3 Dalit women in the Council of Ministry. But there were no op-eds about it. The NYTs and the WOPOs didn't care to write essays about it. And there is something which is a cause of concern as well. That at the level of representation, so much is being done. But still, whenever there is a conversation on diversity and inclusion, we are still termed as archaic. And that is definitely a cause. For the first time, we saw, because there is a provision of presidential nomination to the upper house of the parliament, the Rajya Sabha. It took 70 years for the union government to nominate a scheduled caste artist for the Rajya Sabha. For the first time, it was Mr. Ilayya Raja from Tamil Nadu. Since 1952, there was a provision that in the art and the artist category, you can send people. People were sent. But almost 70 years for the government to have this vision and have this idea that it can also nominate someone from the subaltern marginalized group. How Padma Awards used to be an elite space. It was being distributed solely on the basis of your proximity. आप 10 जनपद के कितने करीब, आप दरबारी कर रहे हैं कि नहीं कर रहे हैं, इस आधार पे पद्मा अवार्ड्स दिए जाते हैं. How this entire process of Padma Awards has been democratized. The civilian honors. There is a tribal poet from Odisha, Aldar Nag. He was given birth. Who would have thought it? 10 years ago, that someone like, who would have thought that someone like Ilayya Raj from the presidential nomination category would go to Rajya Sabha? So these are something which is revolutionary. But unfortunately, the conversations are not happening. Ideally, after the nomination of Draupadi Murmu ji as the president, should have organized multiple seminars here in the US as well, in the Western world. And a woman from the Adivasi Samaj. Because another buzzword is indigenous here. A woman from the Adivasi Samaj reaching the highest constitutional office in the country. What a story it is. A lady who lost her husband, her 2 sons, but her spirit is still intact. And how successfully she has navigated. I think this is something which we must start talking about next. So, in a way, you see, whenever we speak of diversity and inclusion, we must have this sense of perspective that a lot of us, we get defensive in a way whenever there is a conversation on caste issue, whenever there is a conversation on Dalit. But predominantly, what we have seen in the last 8 years through the Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav initiative, how icons from the Dalit Samaj, for example, Babu Jagjeevan Ram. I saw another classification here yesterday that there is a category of Dharmic Dalits and non-Dharmic Dalits. I see it's preposterous. What are you talking about? Oxymoron. A Dalit is necessarily Dharmic. Dalits have essentially been the civilizational soldiers, the Sanatani soldiers. The part of India from where I come, Chhat Puja, the Kavod Yatra. If you do a statistical analysis, you would see the majority of people who are doing Chhat Puja, the majority of the people undertaking the Kavod Yatra, they are from Dalit Samaj. But easily you are saying that when you Hindu pyramid mein nahi aata. It has no connection to logic or rationality. From the political side, this is happening. Now, this entire social justice brigade, back home, like from where I come, there's a section of the political leadership who are constantly saying we need caste census, we need caste census. Jatiya jangarna honi chahiye. Because we'll get an idea of castes which are left behind. Now, in Bihar, the government changed. The same people who were talking about caste census, when it came to sharing of power, you look at their council of ministry. One caste, one community, one family. They themselves are not willing to share power. And they are sermonizing on social justice. There is a political party in Eastern Uttar Pradesh. It's called Raja Suhel Dev Bharatiya Samaj Party. They're doing politics in the name of Raja Suhel Dev, but a smarak, a monument on the name of the Bharatiya Janata Party.
So this narrative must be sort of side, on the cultural side, on the political side.
So much is being done, but the battles are being won. But the narrative side is still an area where we need to work. I had this brief sort of idea. I think it sort of benefited and added value to your information of this. Thank you so much for being patient listeners. Wow.
Yeah, thank you. Very good. Thank you for yeah. So, your personal experience and the achievements also. Congratulations. Few things I want to see. I'm in this social, political issues have been doing a lot of work. I have written a book on mostly on geopolitics, probably from that. So let me focus on the main questions. The narrative is said, so that is coming from the cancel culture. So there is a huge subaltern studies going on in the West for 30, 40 years. And the main purpose is cancel culture. They want to only have their narrative. So we need to figure out to come out of that. We can't keep blaming this. India is the largest population populated country in the world now. Is going to so we need to build our own set. So that is our job. Okay. So that is where all the points you posted, okay, are excellent narrative by itself. So this has to be coming out. So what are your plans on doing that? And the second part is the person who is targeted in the caste plan. I had a talk with the person. So a lot of inside information is there. The government, that is California government, state itself has taken a narrative and a false narrative and using it to push that case, which is not even it's of another country. Okay, here it's are very small. Second is they are not qualified, whatever it is during this period. Third is false narrative. Okay, so that means our narrative is being hijacked everywhere. And here is a perfect example. So in so my question is, we need to figure out a way to come out of that. You raise this, but it has to come from India. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And good that you mentioned about cancel culture, because this year on April 14, I was first invited by a very prestigious college of Delhi University, Lady Shriram College, and then eventually I was uninvited because apparently they think that I represent an exclusivist, bigoted institution and they do not want to share stage with me. So yes, I agree with you that enough of playing the victim card and what can be done from our side. And it's a collective, it must be a collective initiative. Like it cannot solely be some individual's responsibility or some individual organization's responsibility. I think it has to be a collective effort. And like I said, that we have to look within ourselves, that as when we turn the searchlight inwards, we realize that as a group, have we sort of cultivated or promoted independent, objective, and dispassionate scholarship on Dalit issues? Have we sort of organized institutional support for Dalit scholars who are not affiliated, who are not sort of associated with any particular ideology? And I think this is where we need to work. And obviously, like on the side of narrative, it's very critical. It's very important that the government is also taking it very seriously, because if something is being written somewhere, the cognizance is being taken off. But it has to be a social initiative. It has to be an academic initiative like FIIDS or similar socio-cultural organizations in the United States, where we turn the searchlight inwards and see that what have we done and what have, and obviously if you start something and then there will be complementary efforts along with it.
Yeah. I'm Ramesh Japra. As Andiraji mentioned, founded Americans for Hindus organization just a few years ago. One of the reasons is that, what you described very comprehensively about India's progress, how we've been taking care of the underprivileged. We commend BJP, Modi Saab, and everybody who's involved in this. Feel very, very proud. Absolutely fantastic. But as Indians, as Indian Americans, as humanitarians, I think we feel great. But as Hindu Americans, many of us feel that we getting the short end of the stick. We really don't feel as good about what's being done back home or globally, and especially in America as well, where we have to counter some of the equality labs, which you mentioned, and some CARE and IMF, MC rather, and some of these organizations whose narrative and whose agenda is totally different. They want Islamic Republic of Pakistan or Sudan, the whole country, and then we are really scared that our grandkids won't be able to go back to the motherland, to the roots of Hinduism and the country where we belong, like you said. And some of these Dalit groups and other groups are here. They come and protest on our festivals, on our cultural events, on whatever we do. They join Khalistanis, they join Islamists and everybody else. They're making a group. And of course, once you mentioned about New York Times and CNN of the world and ABC and MSNBC, universities, schools, corporate world like Cisco's, and even the Congress now, 1196, Elon Musk of the world. They're shafting us and they're just putting us under the bus, left and right. And we don't feel empowered enough to counter them. And India, sometimes we feel that same thing is happening. And many people here present sometimes even what BJP has not been able to take action. And we understand, some of us understand where we coming from, Sabka Vikas, Sabka Swas and everything else, and getting the underprivileged up there. Well, what do you think we should be doing here, and how we should feel that our grandkids won't be able to go back to India if their narrative wins and India does become an Islamist country in the future?
Well, I personally am not very pessimistic about it, because the narrative which they are pushing, it has no logic or rationality, like the one you see on the Dalit Muslim axis, because it was experimented obviously with Jogennath Mandal. And in 2017 also, this example is important because Bahujan Samaj Party had this experiment of fielding Muslim candidates and experimenting with Dalit Muslim axis, which she failed miserably. So likewise, other narratives as well. When you say that there is a very interesting example of Ramnami Samaj, Ramnami community in Chhattisgarh. And when the assertion is being made that Dalits are sort of not, are excluded from the structures of power, the structures of property, the structures of worship. So this Ramnami community has a very interesting story. They were denied entry to temple. Like, there is no running away from the fact. It is a social evil. It is definitely a problem at so many levels. But at the same time, whenever there was a problem, we had a reformer like Kabir, a reformer like Sant Ravidas. Many such reformers, like our story is full of reformers. Like if you go through the book that we have written, we have Ayangali from Kerala, Narayan Guru from Kerala, we have Guram Joshua from Andhra Pradesh, Thiruvalur from Tamil Nadu. So accepting the problem, coming back to the story of Ramnami Samaj, so they were denied entry into the temple. What they did, that they tattooed the name of Ram all across their body, and they said, if you don't allow us entry to temple, we'll make our body a temple. So this is the level of faith and commitment of a Dalit person towards Hindutva, towards the Hindu Dharma. So number of efforts back home and here are being made to sort of make this assertion that it's exclusionary, it excludes a large population, but that's far from reality. And I think once, obviously, the realization dawns upon this effort of narrative, and I don't have a ready-made answer to it, that how do we deal with this question of narrative, because it impacts. It impacts on the investment in our country, it impacts on the atmosphere, it impacts on the rankings as well. But we cannot say this and run away from the reality that we are winning elections time and again. It is definitely a cause of concern, and we need a coherent articulation from our side to deal with, which is definitely.
Hello. So I have two questions. One is about the eventually India hopefully will get to uniform civil code, and that would be taken as again Hindu cause, and then a lot of narrative would be created that it's against Muslims and this history. So how is the BJP preparing country to get ready for that eventually, whenever they have majority and constitutional change? And second one, more local, applicable to us, is like these narratives, what we are talking about, are really impacting the thinking of our kids. Like even if they had gone through Shaka and then Hindu upbringing, but when they read about in New York Times and Washington Post, the narrative is really impacting and they start thinking negatively. So what should we do as a community here, as a parents here, to really influence that it's not what you read in New York Times?
Very interesting, sir. About UCC, I think it's a constitutional prerogative. Like it's not about the BJP or the Congress. Obviously, we have our certain positions on this issue, but Article 44 categorically tells us of the Constitution of India that it is a state prerogative and which must be followed. And there will definitely be opposition. There was opposition when Article 370 was abrogated. A lot of us were labeled as anti-Dalit, anti-constitution. But again, that was far from reality. The largest number of beneficiaries after the abrogation of Article 370 were Dalits. Like they were not treated as human beings when Article 370 was in operation. Like for example, you see democratic process. You had large number of people coming and participating in the DDC polls, the local polls in Jammu and Kashmir, once Article 370 was abrogated from places like Kupwara, very traditionally disturbed area. So there will definitely be opposition in terms of narrative, but when the time comes and there is definitely a thinking and it's a state matter. It is not something which like Goa is an exception in this case. Uttarakhand, for that matter, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, they have all initiated the stakeholder consultations as far as UCC is concerned. Stakeholder consultation in the sense different groups are being consulted with, interacted with, and at the right time you would see some positive steps in the direction of UCC as well. I cannot give you an exact timeline, but definitely the process has started, which is a welcome sign. Second question on how do we deal with this question and it comes to our children, our second generation. I think from our side, how are we sensitizing them to these issues? Like, are we sensitive enough? Because apparently what happened, and this is very true. Like when I was growing up, a lot of my friends used to say that, no, caste is a very primitive concept. We don't believe in caste. My grandfather, my grandmother used to sit with you guys. I mean, this is generally laughable. You're treating a human being as a human being and you're taking it as a badge of honor. एक आदमी से आदमी की तरह व्यवहार करते हैं और फिर कहते हैं कि हमें इसके लिए सम्मानित करिए. So how insensitive we have been towards this cause. Like when I say we have to turn the searchlight within, I mean a lot of introspection and exercise which we have to do ourselves as well. That how sensitive and are we making our kids more sensitive or not? Like before the selection of Draupadi Murmu ji as president, I'm sure, like from my generation, there were jokes being made on surnames like Murmu, Ekka, Hembrim, but now it has become mainstream. So this is something which will not happen overnight, but as far as our kids are concerned, I think sensitization is the only way, because it has been there and it is not alien to our culture. The three foundational texts of our culture and civilization, Mahabharata, Ramayana, and the Constitution of India, if you say. Mahabharata was authored by a Dalit, Ramayana was authored by a Dalit, the Constitution of India was authored by a Dalit. So there is absolutely no question of sort of keeping Dalits in a different silo and our culture and civilization in a different silo. But on our part, are we sort of doing our duty when it comes to sensitizing our next generation?
Thank you so much. You've been articulate, you're thoughtful, and your comments were astute. Even when you disagree, you're respectful and being able to make a point. I'd like to make two observations, I'd like to make a suggestion, which will hopefully elicit a response from you. You mentioned the idea of yapism and Vikism, but where they have succeeded is coalition building with anybody who has an axe to grind with us. And then the question always comes down to it as, do we perceive this thing? Do we create situations that sometimes result in a response? Every action has an equal and opposite response. Your rhetoric, damage. And when you do that, do we speak as Indian Americans who happen to be Hindus? Talk about Hindus and my political voice that's being muted. There are certain disagreements with our perspective on this. Your concept about what India is doing, what it's done, the experiment of India, has strengthened itself under Prime Minister Modi. It's done a phenomenal job. India I lived 36 years ago was a very pluralistic country. I never knew the difference. I still believe that is the case. And I'll keep this very brief. I believe the imperfections of our democracy, triggered out of the clause of colonialism, results in imperfections. And you said, well, let's look inward. What can we do to come back and acknowledge the imperfections of our democracy? I think is what you were trying to reference to. You mentioned about diversity, you mentioned about inclusiveness. In America, they have fundamentally shifted the conversation to a conversation about income inequality. And they've inserted it as diversity, equity, and inclusiveness. Can we flip the narrative by coming back and saying nobody will be left behind? Are we fundamentally leading the conversation about imperfections and saying that colonialism has taken a time and a generation of people will take time in believing what the Prime Minister has espoused because he made a clarion call? Can we fundamentally acknowledge that there are imperfections in our society, but we're going to ensure that nobody's left behind? Can we flip the narrative? And I'll tell you why I say this. This is where I'm question. Would we go talk to members of Congress or the United States senators or mayors and everybody else who seems to be deluged by those that have a narrative different than ours? We don't have the time to do it. Can we just fundamentally say that India is going to leave nobody behind? And that the imperfections rise to the top. There's a clarion call. There's time that's being taken. And look at all the progress we've made. The changes won't happen overnight. Is that the right way to correct those that are hell bent upon destroying us?
Very interesting that you say that we need coalition building from our side when it comes to countering the false narratives and the fake propaganda. And obviously, you see, when I say that in 2019 elections, we got 4 crore more popular votes in comparison to 2014. And that is a sort of, when Indian voters are reflective than any other voters in the entire world, and they test you, they question you, and whenever we go to our elections, like, that is the most interesting exercise. And democracy again is very inherent because it was first conceived. You look at Lichvi republics in Vaishali, and generally also, if you see our foundational text, the Upanishads, they're part of a dialogue between Yam and Nachiket. Gita, in a sense, is also part of a dialogue. Constitution, the Constituent Assembly debates. So obviously, but interestingly, when you say that, can we make a level playing field, and a conversation on income inequality is definitely, it's time we start speaking about it. And I won't suggest a utopia, but when we say that Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, Sabka Vishwas, it is not just a sloganeering or a rhetoric, It's a commitment for each one of us. Like when I gave you the data of 8 ministers from the scheduled caste, 12 ministers from the scheduled caste, 8 from the tribal community, a tribal community woman at the highest constitutional office. This is, in a sense, a step in that direction where we are ensuring that no one will be left behind, be it SCs, STs, OBCs. Interestingly, Pasmanda question has also raised that the caste issues within Islam, which is not being talked about so much, like if you look at the post-independence beneficiaries within the Muslims in India, they come from upper caste. All the bureaucrats, all the political leaders, they're ashrafs. So if you do a broad classification of the Muslim society, there are ashrafs who are the elite forward class Muslims. There are azrafs and there are arzals. The arzals are Dalit Muslims, and how they have been sort of institutionally discriminated and how their concerns are not being spoken about. So today, fortunately, the leadership in India is not making any sort of distinction. If a toilet is being constructed, we are not asking of whose house the toilet is being constructed. We have had bypolls in Uttar Pradesh recently, in Rampur and Azamgarh, which is predominantly a Muslim seat. Bharatiya Janata Party won with very handsome margin. So today, obviously, I mean, the makers of narrative and the discourse builders would not agree with me, but the people of India have a different side of it. And they are time and again repeatedly reposing their faith in the man and the policies.
Like, and then we'll so the online question, Dr. Sampath Shivangi. To unmute.
Thank you, Kandarajee. I'm sorry. I was in the middle of something. Thank you for taking my question. My question is about China, India, and Russia relations. Recently, we have noted that China and Russia are getting very close. And even they are building a military alliance against Ukraine. But what would happen if there is conflict between India and China? Where does Russia stand? Will they go with China? They will be neutral, or will they support India as they did before?
Thank you, Dr. Sampath Shivangi ji. I'll pass on to GuruPrakash ji. However, the topic of today's discussion and this question is a little bit different. So we'll say that at the best of his thoughts, I think let him.
No, as a spokesperson, I think we are always ready to take questions for which we are not prepared. But obviously, you see, in this, like in the last 8 years, Sampath, if you see the foreign policy perspective and the sort of reception which the Honorable Prime Minister has received across the globe, like more than 10 countries have given him the top civilian honors. Like countries which were usually, we did not expect that country would give him the top civilian honors, like has been given that. Like his leadership, there are surveys time and again which are showing that internally and externally the popularity on the graph of Prime Minister is in a high. There will be no compromise when it comes to the interest of our country, when it comes to our Swabhiman, when it comes to our self-respect. We need to look at this from this perspective only, that whether it's a question of China or Russia, our leadership has spoken about it. We are in favor of rule-based order. And we will go to any level to ensure that rule-based order is being abided to. And we'll raise our voice if we see that there is some sort of crossing the line by any party, howsoever powerful. We'll definitely register our protest and raise our voice. Thank you, Sampath.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Enjoyed your speech.
I have a question. You mentioned in your talk how even Atal Bihari Vajpayee said that reservation is a historical baggage and that has to be paid. And I really appreciate those people who, in spite of all these insults, remained into the Hindu and not converted. And I really appreciate, including Mayawati also, because she didn't convert, but if she says something, we listen to her to that extent. And so now the new problem has come in India from Andhra to Punjab, that there are crypto Christians. They are taking advantage, yet they convert, they become Baptist and all. I'm fully okay with that, that this award or whatever historical thing has to be given who really remain in spite of all, and we need to give them this. So how we should counter that in the terms of policy to identify them that, hey, you converted, now you are out of it. You should not get that benefit. That's my question number one. And number two, if you have you heard that Savarkar also started this Patit Pawan movement, and even Lata Mangeshkar has mentioned that we used to go to Harijan Basti and have a Sahabhojan, means that everybody has to eat together to show they are our brothers. Even Brahmins has opposed Savarkar. He said, no, I'll take all the rituals for them. Why not? So now this narrative is being created about Savarkar. The Dalit angle has to be brought out that he has done a lot for them during that time when it was not supposed to be that easy. So these two things, I want your answer on.
Very interesting, sir. And obviously, you have an insight on this issue. And you see, tall Dalit leaders after Ambedkar, Babu Jagjeevan Ram, I consider as one great example, a stalwart. He is the only Dalit to ever reach to the high office of Deputy Prime Minister of the country. He had a very stellar role to play as Defense Minister during the 1971 war. A national Dalit leader. He never changed his religion. You go to his memorial in New Delhi, you would see a tulsi plant which was being worshipped and watered by her late wife Indrani Devi as long as she was alive. Mayawati, you mentioned, Kanshiram, Ramvilas Paswan. So all the Dalit leadership, they haven't converted, they haven't changed their religion. So there is absolutely no question of conversion. But whether the benefits of reservation can be given to them, there was a committee, such a committee. Such a committee recommended that the reservation status must be extended to people who have converted. Back then, we opposed it, and certainly there is an examination. But if you look at it from a perspective of the Dalit side, you must realize that the grounds on which these people converted, they said that we are shifting because we believe that there is no discrimination in that belief system. So if there is no discrimination, then why are you entitled to the benefits of reservation? So that is a churning which is happening. There is no judicial position or there is no government of India position on this yet. But let me assure you that from the side of the Dalit Samaj, the perspective of Dalit Samaj, it is very clear and it's very categorical that people who have converted, obviously they have converted for multiple reasons. The benefits of reservations, the people who deserve the benefits of reservation, they are from the Hindu Dalit Samaj and not going beyond that. There is a clarity and consensus on this.
Thanks for clarifying and telling about sensitizing. That's very important. My question is, I think all Dalit movements help preserve Dalits and integrate into the society. I'm familiar with most of the Dalit movements, but I do not know much about Orissa. So can you tell something about what is happening in the Dalits of Orissa?
If you, like, Honorable President of India, she comes from Odisha, Mayurbhanj. So obviously there is a churning, and like you mentioned about Dalit movements in a sense, we have seen the reform movements, Kabir movement, Ravidas, Ayankali in the south, and Chokha Mela in Maharashtra. A lot of movements that have happened has been to keep the society intact and sort of rectify the errors the social evils that unfortunately came in the course of time.
Thanks for the presentation. I have just a general question. See, the Dalit issues are brought in the US without some kind of background or anything. There is it's just the lived experience. They're saying their lived experience is because they're discriminated and all the stuff. I don't know. We don't know the truth of that. The question is a legal point of view. Is India is going to help, say, some kind of providing the certifications or something if California has to, they have to start the process of caste discrimination or anything. How do you legal wise, how does that work? Is that India going to cooperate or India is not going to say that they're not going to be willing to cooperate? Because in the past, I think they rejected in the UN also.
So definitely there have been attempts to internationalize, globalize the issues of caste. And there has been a stated position that it's our domestic internal issue and there is absolutely no need, no requirement to internationalize it. अब परिवार के अंदर कोई समस्या उसको परिवार के अंदर ही समाधान करेंगे. There is no question. Obviously, it's a matter of future. ये भविष्य के गर्भ में है. अभी इस पे कुछ टिप्पणी करना उचित नहीं है. But as far as our position is concerned, we are of the opinion that we are competent enough, we are capable enough, and our history tells us, like I said, that the history of social reforms, if you see, it's been there. The history of reforms, which I just spoke, I gave you the data, I gave you the level of inclusion and representation that is happening now. So I don't think that even in the future there would be such a position, but that is something which lies in the future, and I would not like to take a committed stand on that.
Okay. It's a good talk. My name is Kiran Maya. I come from Udupi, Karnataka. You know Udupi very well by now because of the hijab issue. Good that you mentioned Professor R. Vaidyanathan's quote on that caste and the business that goes with that. I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong. In our place, the true majority of the jobs that they take or the skills they have is one for the essence, or is one the tannery, the leather thing, and another one is the footwear. So in the last 30, 40 years, I'm just seeing that slowly it has with the Jaibin, it has gone from Jaibin to Jain. Now, if you see all, I don't know whether it is true in Bihar and other places, all the tannery has gone to Muslims. And all the footwear thing is maybe influence of Dawood, and because they started with that one, right? So all the main industry has gone to them. Is there any way that is coming back, or are we doing that one? Because I don't see any major SE owned big industries in that sector.
Certainly, see, in Kanpur, which is famous for the leather footwear, a lot of industry, a lot of tannery is still being owned and operated by Dalits primarily. But obviously, in certain areas, and the fundamental reason behind it is the dignity of labor, because time and again, repeatedly, the dignity of labor point was not taken into consideration. And there is a separate, like similar to your point which you raised, there is a movement of Jhatka, right? Of it's become a very national movement for, like, people have started speaking about Jhatka mutton business as well. That why not prefer Jhatka? Because that is also associated with the traditional occupation. If you see the Khatik Samaj, Khatik is related to the Khatik word. Etymologically, it comes from Khatak and Jhatka, and Khatiks are predominantly scheduled caste. So this initiative must come from within, and obviously, like Sant Ravidas and Valmiki, like and these icons are very important. Like these icons play a very important role because they inspire. Sant Ravidas was essentially came from the community of shoemakers, and the dignity of labor back at that time was accorded due respect. But in the course of time, because of multiple interventions and invasion, it became sort of this occupation, it shifted. And definitely with initiatives like Jhatka, we would definitely see that some big businessmen, like the initiative which I mentioned about Dalit Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, that there are businesses, there are entrepreneurs with a turnover of more than 1,000 crore who are doing this traditional occupation as well. But definitely, if opportunities will be created, innovation and more entrepreneurship, people from the Dalit community will definitely engage and come out with great ideas on this issue.
I would like to say, thanks a lot, GuruPrakash, for giving a very data-driven and like very emotional also, because I have seen most of us have seen things in the past, and so hopefully things will change as we go, and we'll be part of that movement also. Thanks a lot to each of you to come over with the busy on your busy time. Thanks a lot, Rakhi, for the facility. Thanks a lot, Nitesh. You two last minute help a lot in setting up project actually, which took a long time. And our online